We are going to start over here again. There were a couple of technical difficulties, so here we go again with Storytime Classics Live, and this time with audio. What a concept. So that must have been very entertaining also. So here we go again. These things happen, and we're just going to restart and reform. Because what can you do? And it gave me a little insight into what was coming. So here we go. Finding my place again. Hope everyone is having a better day technically than myself. These things happen and they're amusing. We'll call them amusing. Actually, there's probably another word. I ramble. Here we go. Finding my place, and we're good. Okay. Strolling down memory lane. Here comes Santa Claus. Here comes Santa Claus. Right down Santa Claus Lane. Everybody having fun here? This is great. All right. I am rapidly trying to find my place, and this is hysterical. So I hope this is entertaining for everybody. It certainly is for me on a certain level. And we're almost to where I need to be here. This is what life is about. Little hiccups and not throwing things at the screen in front of you because things went bad. All right, here we are again. Chapter 8th. The first journey with the reindeer. For real this time. Those were happy days for Claus, when he carried his accumulation of toys to the children who had waited them so long. During his imprisonment in the valley, he had been so industrious that all his shelves were filled with playthings, and after quickly supplying the little ones living nearby, he saw he must now extend his travels to wider fields. Remembering the time when he had journeyed with Ak through all the world, he knew children were everywhere, and he longed to make as many as possible happy with his gifts. So he loaded a great sack with all kinds of toys, slung it upon his back that he might carry it more easily, and started off on a longer trip than he had yet undertaken. Wherever he showed his merry face, in hamlet or in farmhouse, he received a cordial welcome, for his fame had spread into far lands. At each village the children swarmed about him, following his footsteps wherever he went, and the women thanked him gratefully for the joy he brought their little ones, and the men looked upon him curiously that he should devote his time to such a queer occupation as toy-making. But everyone smiled on him and gave him kindly words, and Claus felt amply repaid for his long journey. When the sack was empty, he went back again to the Laughing Valley and once more filled it to the brim. This time, he followed another into a different part of the country and carried happiness to many children who never before owned a toy or guessed that such a delightful plaything existed. After a third journey, so far away that Claus was many days walking the distance, the store of toys became exhausted, and without delay he set about making a fresh supply. From seeing so many children and studying their tastes, he had acquired several new ideas about toys. The dollies were, he had found, the most delightful of all playthings for babies and little girls, and often those who could not say dolly would call for a doll on their sweet baby talk. So Claus resolved to make many dolls of all sizes and to dress them in bright-colored clothing. The other boys, and even some of the girls, loved the images of animals, so he still made cats and elephants and horses. And many of the little fellows had musical natures, and longed for drums and cymbals and whistles and horns. So he made a number of toy drums with tiny sticks to beat them with, and he made whistles from the willow trees, and horns and cymbals from bits of beaten metal. All this kept him busily at work, and before he realized it, the winter season came, with deeper snows than usual, and he knew he could not leave the valley with his heavy pack. Moreover, the next trip would take him farther from home than ever before, and Jack Frost was mischievous enough to nip his nose and ears if he undertook the long journey while the Frost King reigned. The Frost King was Jack's father, and never reproved him for his pranks. So Claus remained at his workbench, but he whistled and sang as merrily as ever, for he would follow no disappointment to sour his temper or make him unhappy. One bright morning, he looked from his window and saw two of the deer he had known in the forest walking toward his house. Claus was surprised, not that the friendly deer should visit him, but that they walked on the surface of the snow as easily as if it were solid ground, notwithstanding the fact that throughout the valley the snow lay many feet deep. He had walked out of his house a day or two before and had sunk into his armpits in a drift. So when the deer came near, he opened the door and called to them, "Good morning, Flossie. Tell me, how are you able to walk on the snow so easily?" "It is frozen hard," answered Flossie. "The Frost King has breathed on it," said Glossie. "Coming up, this is now as solid as ice." "Perhaps," remarked Claus thoughtfully, "I might now carry my pack of toys to the children." "Is it a long journey?" asked Flossie. "Yes, it will take many days, for the pack is heavy," answered Claus. "Then the snow would melt before you could get back," said the deer. "You must wait until spring, Claus." Claus sighed. "Had I your fleet feet," said he, "I could make the journey in a day." "But you have not," returned Glossie, looking at his own slender legs with pride. "Perhaps I could ride upon your back," Claus ventured to remark after a pause. "Oh, no, our backs are not strong enough to bear your weight," said Flossie decidedly. "But if you had a sledge, and could harness us to it, we might draw you easily, and your pack as well." "I'll make a sledge," exclaimed Claus. "Will you agree to draw me if I do?" "Well," replied Flossie, "we must first go and ask the Knooks, who are our guardians, for permission. But if they consent, and you can make a sledge and harness, we will gladly assist you." "Then go at once," cried Claus eagerly. "I am sure the friendly Knooks will give their consent, and by the time you are back, I shall be ready to harness you to my sledge." Flossie, being deer of much intelligence, had long wished to see the great world, so they gladly ran over the frozen snow to ask the Knooks if they might carry Claus on his journey. Meantime, the toy maker hurriedly began the construction of a sledge, using material from his woodpile. He made 2 long runners that turned upward at the front ends, and across these nailed short boards to make a platform. It was soon completed, but was as rude in appearance as it is possible for a sledge to. The harness was more difficult to prepare, but Claus twisted strong cords together and knotted them so they could fit around the necks of the deer, in the shape of a collar. From these ran other cords to fasten the deer to the front of the sledge. Before the work was completed, Glossie and Flossie were back from the forest, having been granted permission by Will Knook to make the journey with Claus, provided they would to Burzee by daybreak the next morning. "That is not a very long time," said Flossie, "but we are swift and strong, and if we get started by this evening, we can travel many miles during the night." Claus decided to make the attempt, so he hurried on his preparations as fast as possible. After a time, he fastened the collars around the necks of his steeds and harnessed them to his rude sledge. Then he placed a stool on the little platform to serve as a seat, and filled a sack with his prettiest toys. "How do you intend to guide us?" asked Glossie. "We have been out of the forest before, except to visit your house, so we shall not know the way." Claus thought about that for a moment. Then he brought more cords and fastened 2 of them to the spreading antlers of each deer, one on the right and the other on the left. "These will be my reins," said Claus, "and when I pull them to the right or the left, you must go in that direction. If I do not pull the reins, at all, you may go straight ahead." "Very well," answered Glossie and Flossie, and then they asked. Claus seated himself upon the stool, placed the sack of toys at his feet, and then gathered up the reins. "All ready," he shouted. "Away we go!" The deer leaned forward, lifted their slender limbs, and the next moment away flew the sledge over the frozen snow. The swiftness of the motion surprised Claus, for in a few strides they were across the valley and gliding over the broad plain beyond. The day had melted into evening by the time they started, for swiftly as Claus had worked, many hours had been consumed in making his preparations. But the moon shone brightly to light their way, and Claus soon decided it was just as pleasant to travel by night as by day. The deer liked it better, for although they wished to see something of the world, they were timid about meeting men, and now all the dwellers of the towns and farmhouses were sound asleep and could not see them. Away and away they sped, on and on, over the hills and through the valleys, and across the plains until they reached a village where Claus had never been before. He called on them to stop, and they immediately obeyed. But a new difficulty now presented itself, for the people had locked their doors when they went to bed, and Claus found he could not enter the houses to leave his toys. "I am afraid, my friends, we have made our journey for nothing," said he, "for I shall be obliged to carry my playthings back home again without giving them to the children of this village." "What's the matter?" asked Flossie. "The doors are locked," answered Claus, "and I cannot get in." Glossie looked around at the houses. The snow was quite deep in that village, and just before them was a roof only a few feet above the sledge, a broad chimney which seemed to Glossie to admit Claus was at the peak of the roof. "Why don't you climb down that chimney?" asked Glossie. Claus looked at it. "That would be easy enough if I were on top of the roof," he answered. "Then hold fast, and we will take you there," said the deer, and they gave one bound to the roof and landed beside the big chimney. "Good!" cried Claus, well pleased, and he slung the pack of toys over his shoulder and got into the chimney. There was plenty of soot on the bricks, but he did not mind that, and by placing his hands and knees against the sides, he crept downward until he had reached the fireplace. Leaping lightly over the smoldering coals, he found himself in a large sitting room where a dim light was burning. From this room, 2 doorways led into smaller chambers. In one, a woman lay asleep with a baby beside her in a crib. Claus laughed, but he did not laugh aloud for fear of waking the baby. Then he slipped a big doll from his pack and laid it in the crib. The little smiled, as if it dreamed of the pretty plaything it was to find on the morrow. And Claus crept softly from the room and entered at the other doorway. Here were 2 boys, fast asleep with their arms around each other's neck. Claus gazed at them lovingly a moment, and then placed upon the bed a drum, 2 horns, and a wooden elephant. He did not linger, now that his work in this house was done, but climbed the chimney again and seated himself on his sledge. "Can you find another chimney?" he asked the reindeer. "Easily enough," replied Glossie and Flossie. Down to the ledge of the roof they raced, and then, without pausing, leaped through the air to the top of the next building, where a huge, old-fashioned chimney stood. "Don't be so long this time," called Flossie, "or we shall never get back to the forest by daybreak." Claus made a trip down this chimney also, and found 5 children sleeping in the house, all of whom were quickly supplied with toys. Turned, the deer sprang to the next roof, but on descending the chimney, Claus found no children there at all. That was not often the case in this village. However, so he lost less time than you might suppose in visiting the dreary homes where there were no little ones. When he had climbed down the chimneys of all the houses in that village, and had left a toy for every sleeping child, Claus found that his great sack was not yet half emptied. "Onward, friends!" he called to the deer. "We must seek another village." So away they dashed, although it was long past midnight, and in a surprisingly short time they came to a large city, the largest Claus had since he began to make toys. But, nothing daunted by the throng of houses, he set to work at once, and his beautiful steeds carried him rapidly from one roof to another, only the highest being beyond the leaps of the agile deer. At last the supply of toys was exhausted, and Claus seated himself in the sledge, with the empty sack at his feet, and turned the heads of Glossie and Flossie toward home. Presently Flossie asked, "What is that gray streak in the sky?" "It is the coming dawn of day," answered Claus, surprised to find it was so late. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Glossie. "Then we shall not be home by daybreak, and the Knooks will punish us and never let us come again." "We must race for the Laughing Valley and make our best speed," returned Flossie. "So hold fast, friend Claus." Claus held fast, and the next moment was flying so swiftly over the snow that he could not see the trees as they whirled past, up hill and down dale, swift as an arrow shot from a bow as they dashed. And Claus shut his eyes to keep the wind out of them and left the deer to find their own way. It seemed to him they were plunging through space, but he was not at all afraid. The Knooks were severe masters and must be obeyed at all hazards, and the gray streak in the sky was growing brighter every moment. Finally, the sledge came to a sudden stop, and Claus, who was taken unawares, tumbled from his seat into a snowdrift. As he picked himself up, he heard the deer crying, "Quick, friend, quick! Cut away our harness!" He drew his knife and rapidly severed the cords, and then he wiped the moisture from his eyes and looked around him. The sledge had come to a stop in the Laughing Valley, only a few feet, he found, from his own door. In the east the day was breaking, and turning to the edge of the Burzee, he saw Glossie and Flossie just disappearing into the forest. Chapter 9th. Santa Claus! Claus thought that none of the children would ever know where toys came from when they found by their bedsides when they wakened the following morning. But kindly deeds are sure to bring fame, and fame has many wings to carry its tidings into far lands. So for miles and miles in every direction, people were talking of Claus and his wonderful gifts and children. The sweet generousness of his work caused a few selfish folk to sneer, but even those were forced to admit their respect for a man so gentle-natured that he loved to devote his life to pleasing the helpless little ones of his race. Therefore, the inhabitants of every city and village had been eagerly watching the coming of Claus, and remarkable stories of his beautiful playthings were told the children to keep them patient and contented. When, on the morning following the first trip of Claus with his deer, the little ones running to their parents with the pretty toys they had found, and asked from whence they came, there was but one reply to the question. The good Claus must have been there, my darlings, for his are the only toys in all the world. But how did he get in? Asked the children. At this, the fathers shook their heads, being themselves unable to understand how Claus had gained admittance to their homes. But the mothers, watching the glad ones, whispered that the good Claus was no mortal man, but assuredly a saint, and they piously blessed his name for the happiness that had bestowed upon their children. A saint, said one, with bowed head, has no need to unlock doors if it pleases him to enter our homes. And afterward, when a child was naughty or disobedient, its mother would say, you must pray to the good Santa Claus for forgiveness. He does not like naughty children, and unless you repent, he will bring you no more pretty toys. But Santa Claus himself would not have approved this speech. He brought toys to the children because they were little and helpless, and because he loved them. He knew that the best of children were sometimes naughty, and that the naughty ones were often good. It is the way with children the world over, and he would not have changed their natures had he possessed the power to do so. And that is how our Claus became Santa Claus. It is possible for any man, by good deeds, to enshrine himself as a saint in the hearts of people. Chapter 10th. Christmas Eve. The day that broke as Claus returned night with Glossie and Flossie brought him to a new trouble. Will Nook, the chief guardian of the deer, came to him, surly and ill-tempered, to complain that he had kept Flossie and Glossie beyond daybreak, in opposition to his orders. Yet it could not have been very long after daybreak, said Claus. It was 1 minute after, answered Will Nook, and that is as bad as 1 hour. I shall set the stinging gnats on Glossie and Flossie, and they will thus suffer terribly for their disobedience. Don't do that, begged Claus. It was my fault. But Will Nook would listen to no excuses, and went away grumbling and growling in his ill-natured way. For this reason, Claus entered the forest to consult Necile about rescuing the good deer from punishment. To his delight, he found his old friend, the Master Woodsman, seated in the circle of nymphs. Ak listened to the story of the night journey to the children and of the great assistance the deer had been to Claus by drawing his sledge over the frozen snow. I do not wish my friends to be punished if I can save them, said the toy maker, when he had finished the relation. They were only 1 minute late, and they ran swifter than a bird flies to get home before daybreak. Ak stroked his beard thoughtfully a moment, and then sent for the prince of who rules all his people in Burzee, and also for the queen of the fairies and the prince of the rills. When all had assembled, Claus told his story again, and at Ak's command, and then the master addressed the prince of the Nooks, saying, The good work that Claus is doing among mankind deserves the support of every honest and immortal. Already he is called a saint in some of the towns, and before long the name of Santa Claus will be lovingly known in every home that is blessed with children. Moreover, he is a son of our forest, so we owe him our encouragement. You, ruler of the Nooks, have known him these many years. Am I not right in saying he deserves our friendship? The prince, crooked and sour of visage, was all Nooks are, looked only upon the dead leaves at his feet, and muttered, You are Master Woodsman of the world. Ak smiled, but continued in soft tones. It seems which are guarded by your people can be of great assistance to Claus, and as they seem willing to draw his sledge, I beg that you will permit him to use their services whenever he pleases. The prince did not reply, but tapped the curled point of his sandal with the tip of his spear, as if in thought. The fairy queen spoke to him in this way. If you consent to Ak's request, I will see that no harm comes to your deer while they are away from the forest. And the prince of the rills added, For my part, I will allow every deer that assists Claus the privilege of eating my casa plants, strength, and my growl plants, which give fleetness of foot, and my marbon plants, which give long life. And the queen of the nymphs said, The deer which draw the sledge of Claus will be permitted to bathe in the forest pool of Nars, which give them sleek coats and wonderful beauty. The prince of the Nooks, hearing these promises, shifted uneasily in his seat, for in his heart he hated to refuse a request of his fellow immortals, although they were asking an unusual favor at his hands, and the Nooks are unaccustomed to granting favors of any kind. Finally, he turned to his servants and said, Call Will Nook. Then when surely Will came and heard the demands of the immortals, he protested loudly against granting them. Deer are deer, said he, and nothing but deer. Were they horses, it would be right to harness them like horses. But no one harnesses deer because they are free, wild creatures, owing no service of any sort to mankind. It would degrade my deer to labor for Claus, who is only a man in spite of the friendship lavished on him by the immortals. You have heard, there is truth in what Will says. Call Glossy and Flossie, returned the master. The deer were brought to the conference, and Act asked him if they objected to drawing the sledge for Claus. No, indeed, replied Glossy. We enjoyed the trip very much, and we tried to get home by daybreak, added Flossie, but were unfortunately a minute too late. A minute lost at daybreak doesn't matter, said Ack. You are forgiven for that delay. Provided it does not happen again, said the Prince of the Knooks sternly. And will you permit them to make another journey with me? Asked Claus eagerly. The prince reflected while he gazed at Will, who was scowling, and at the Master Woodsman, who was smiling. Then he stood up and addressed the company as follows. Since you all urge me to grant the favor, I will permit the deer to go with Claus once every year on Christmas Eve, provided they always return to the forest by daybreak. He may select any number he pleases, up to 10, to draw his sledge, and those shall be known among as reindeer, to distinguish them from the others. They shall bathe in the pool of Nars, and eat the casa and growl and marbon plants, and shall be under the especial protection of the fairy queen. And now cease scowling, Will Nook, for my words shall be obeyed. He hobbled quickly away through the trees to avoid the thanks of Claus and the approval of the other, and Will, looking as cross as ever, followed him. But Ack was satisfied, knowing that he could rely on the promise of the prince, however grudgingly given. And Glossy and Flossie ran home, kicking up their heels delightedly at every step. When is Christmas Eve? Claus asked the master. In about 10 days, he replied. Then I cannot use the deer this year, said Claus thoughtfully, for I shall not have time enough to make my sack full of toys. The shrewd prince foresaw that, responded Ack, and therefore named Christmas Eve as the day you might use the deer, knowing it would cause you to lose an entire year. If I only had the toys of the Ogwas that the Ogwas stole from me, said Claus sadly, I could easily fill my sack for the children. Where are they? Asked the master. I do not know, replied Claus, but the wicked Ogwas probably hid them in the mountains. Ack turned very. Can you find them? He asked. I will try, she replied brightly. Then Claus went back to the Laughing Valley to work as hard as he could, and a band of fairies immediately flew to the mountain that had been haunted by the Ogwas and began to search for the stolen toys. The fairies, as we well know, possess wonderful powers, but the cunning Ogwas had hidden the toys in a deep cave and covered the opening with rocks, so no one could look in. Therefore, all search for the missing playthings proved in vain for several days, and Claus, who sat at home waiting for news from the fairies, almost despaired of getting the toys before Christmas Eve. He worked hard for every moment, but it took considerable time to carve out and to shape each toy and to paint it properly, so that on the morning before Christmas Eve, only half of one small shelf above the window was filled with playthings ready for children. But on this morning of the fairies, who were searching the mountains, had a new thought. They joined hands and moved in a straight line through the rocks that formed the mountain, beginning at the topmost peak and working downward, so that no spot could be missed by their bright. And at last they discovered the cave where the toys had been heaped up by the wicked Ogwas. It did not take them long to burst open the mouth of the cave, and then each one seized as many toys as could carry, and they all flew to Claus and laid the treasure before him. The good man was rejoiced to receive, just in the nick of time, such a store of playthings, with which a load with which to load his sledge, and he sent word to Glossie and Flossie to be ready for the journey at nightfall. With all this other labors, he had managed to find time since the last trip to repair the harness and to strengthen his sledge, so that when the deer came to him at twilight, he had no difficulty in harnessing them. "We must go in another direction tonight," he told them, "where we shall find children I have never yet visited. And we must travel fast and work quickly, for my sack is full of toys and running over the brim." So, just as the moon rose, they dashed out of the Laughing Valley and across the plain and over the hills to the south. The air was sharp and frosty, and the starlight touched the snowflakes and made them glitter like countless diamonds. The reindeer leaped onward with strong, ready bounds, and Claus's heart was so light and merry that he laughed and sang while the wind whistled past his ears. With a ho-ho-ho and a ha-ha and a ho-ho-ho-he, now away we go o'er the frozen snow, as merry as we can be. Jack Frost heard him and came racing up with his nippers, but when he saw it was Claus, he laughed and turned away from him. The mother owls heard him as he passed near a wood and struck their heads out of the window, out of the hollow places in the tree trunks. They saw who it was. They whispered to the owlets nesting near them that it was only Santa Claus carrying toys to the children. It is strange how much those mother owls know. Claus stopped at some of the scattered farmhouses and climbed down the chimneys to leave presents for the babies. Soon after, he reached a village and worked merrily for an hour, distributing playthings among the sleeping little ones. Then away again he went, singing his joyous carol. Now away we go o'er the gleaming snow, while the deer runs swift and free. For to the girls and boys carry the toys that will fill their hearts with glee. The deer liked the sound of his deep bass voice, and kept time to the song with their hoofbeats on the hard snow. But soon they stopped at another chimney, and Santa Claus, with sparkling eyes and face, brushed red by the wind, climbed down its smoky sides and left a present for every child the house contained. It was a merry, happy night. Swiftly the deer ran, and busily their driver worked to scatter his gifts among the sleeping children. But the sack was empty at last, and the sledge headed homeward, and now again the race with daybreak began. Glossie and Flossie had no mind to be rebuked a second time for tardiness, so they fled with a swiftness that enabled them to pass the gale on which the Frost King rode, and soon brought them to the Laughing Valley. It is true, when Claus released his steeds from their harness, the eastern sky was streaked with gray, but Glossie and Flossie were deep in the forest before day fairly broke. Claus was so wearied with his night's work, himself upon his bed, and fell into a deep slumber. And while he slept, the Christmas sun appeared in the sky and shone upon hundreds of happy homes, where the sound of childish laughter proclaimed that Santa Claus had made them a visit. God bless him. It was his first Christmas Eve, and for hundreds of years since then, he has nobly fulfilled his mission to bring happiness to the hearts of little children. Chapter 11th. How the first stockings were hung by the chimneys. When you remember that no child, until Santa Claus began his travels, had ever known the pleasure of possessing a toy, you will understand how joy crept into the homes of those who had been favored with a visit from the good man, and how they talked of him day by day in loving tones, and were honestly grateful for his kindly deeds. It is true that great warriors and mighty kings and clever scholars of that day were often spoken of by the people, but no one of them was so greatly beloved as Santa Claus, because none other was so unselfish as to devote himself to making others happy. For a generous deed lives longer than a great battle or a king's decree of a scholar's essay, because it spreads and leaves its mark on all nature and endures through many generations. The bargain made with the Nook Prince changed the plans of Claus for all future time. For, being able to use the reindeer on but one night of each year, he decided to devote all the other days to the manufacture of playthings, and on Christmas Eve to carry them to the children of the world. But a year's work would, he knew, result in a vast accumulation of toys. So he resolved to build a new sledge that would be larger and stronger and better fitted for swift travel than the old and clumsy one. His first act was to visit the Gnome King, with whom he made a bargain to exchange 3 drums, a trumpet, and 2 dolls for a pair of fine steel runners, curled beautifully at the ends. For the Gnome King had children of his own, who, living in the hollows under the earth, in mines and caverns, needed something to amuse them. In 3 days the steers were ready, and when Claus brought the playthings to the Gnome King, his majesty was so greatly pleased with them that he presented Claus with a string of sweet-toned sleigh bells, in addition to the runners. "These will please Glossie and Flossie," said Claus, as he jingled the bells and listened to their merry sound. "But I should have 2 strings of bells, 1 for each deer." "Bring me another trumpet and toy cat," replied the king, "and you shall have a 2nd string of bells like the first." "It is a bargain," cried Claus, and he went home again for the toys. The new sledge was carefully built, the Nooks bringing plenty of strong but thin boards to use in its construction. Claus made a high, rounding dashboard to keep off the snow cast behind by the fleet hooves of the deer, and he made high sides to the platform so that many toys could be carried, and finally he mounted the sledge upon the slender steel runners made by the Gnome King. It was certainly a handsome sledge, and big and roomy. Claus painted it in bright colors, although no one was likely to see it during his midnight journeys. And when all was finished, he sent for Glossie and Flossie to come and look at it. The deer admired the sledge, but gravely declared it was too big and heavy for them to draw. "We might pull it over the snow, to be sure," said Glossie, "but we could not pull it as fast enough to enable us to visit the faraway cities and villages and return to the forest by daybreak." "Then I must add 2 more deer to my team," declared Claus, after a moment's thought. "The Nook Prince allowed you as many as 10. Why not use them all?" asked Flossie. "Then we could speed like the lightning and leap to the highest roofs with ease." "A team of 10 reindeer!" cried Claus delightedly. "That will be splendid. Please return to the forest at once and select 8 other deer as like yourselves as possible. And you must all eat the plant to become strong, and of the growl plant to become fleet of foot, and of the marbon plant that you may live long to accompany me on my journeys. Likewise, it will be well for you to bathe in the pool of Nares, which the lovely Queen Zerline declares will render you rarely beautiful. Should you perform these duties faithfully, there is no doubt that on the next Christmas Eve, my 10 reindeer will be the most powerful and beautiful steeds the world has ever seen." So Glossie and Flossie went to the forest to choose their mates, and Claus began to consider the questions for them all. In the end, he called upon Peter Nook for assistance, for Peter's heart is as kind as his body is crooked, and he is remarkably shrewd as well, and Peter agreed to furnish strips of tough leather for the harness. This leather was cut from the skins of lions that had reached such an advanced age that they died naturally, and on one side was tawny hair, while on the other side was cured to the softness of velvet by the Nooks. When Claus received these strips of leather, he sewed them neatly into a harness for 10 reindeer, and it proved strong and serviceable and lasted him for many years. The harness and sledge were prepared at odd times, for Claus devoted most of his days to the making of toys. These were now much better than the first ones had been, for the immortals often came to his house to watch him work and to offer suggestions. It was Necile's idea to make some of the dolls say Papa and Mama. It was a thought of the nooks inside the lambs, so that when a child squeezed them, they would say Bah. And at the fairy queen advised Claus to put whistles in the birds so they could be made to sing, and wheels on the horses so children could draw them around. Many animals perished in the forest from one cause or another, and their fur was brought to Claus that he might cover it with the small images of beasts he made for playthings. A merry rill suggested that Claus make a donkey with a nodding head, which he did, and afterward found it amused little ones immensely. And so the toys grew in beauty and attractiveness every day, until they were the wonder of even the immortals. When another Christmas Eve drew near, there was a monster load of beautiful gifts for the children ready to be loaded upon the big sledge. Claus filled 3 sacks to the brim, and tucked every corner of the sledge box full of toys besides. Then, at twilight, the 10 reindeer appeared, and Flossie introduced them all to Claus. They were Racer and Pacer, reckless and speckless, fearless and peerless, and ready and steady, who, with Glossie and Flossie, made up the 10 who have traversed the world these hundreds of years with their generous master. They were all exceedingly beautiful, their limbs, spreading antlers, velvety dark eyes, and smooth coats of fawn color spotted with white. Claus loved them at once, and has loved them ever since, for they are loyal friends and have rendered him priceless service. And the new harness fitted them nicely, and soon they were all fastened to the sledge by 2s, with Glossie and Flossie in the lead. Those were the strings of sleigh bells, and so delighted with music they made that they kept prancing up and down to make the bells ring. Claus now seated himself in the sledge, drew a warm robe over his knees and his fur cap over his ears, and cracked his long whip as a signal to start. Instantly, the 10 leaped forward and were away like the wind, while jolly Claus laughed gleefully to see them run and shouted a song in his big, hearty voice, with a ho-ho-ho and a ha-ha-ha and a ho-ha-ho-ha-hee. Now away we go o'er the frozen snow, as merry as we can be. There are many joys in our load of toys, as many a child would know. We'll scatter them wide on our wild night ride, o'er the crisp and sparkling snow. It was on this same Christmas Eve that little Margot and her brother Dick and her cousins Ned and Sarah, who were visiting at Margot's house, came in from making a snowman, with their clothes damp, their mittens dripping, and their shoes and stockings wet through and through. They were not scolded, for Margot's mother knew the snow was melting, but they were sent early to bed that their clothes might be hung over chairs to dry. The shoes were placed on the red tiles of the hearth, where the heat from the hot embers would strike them, and the stockings were carefully hung in a row by the chimney, directly over the fireplace. That was the reason Santa Claus noticed them when he came down the chimney that night, and all the household were fast asleep. He was in a tremendous hurry, and seeing the stockings all belonged to children, he quickly stuffed his toys into them and dashed up the chimney again, appearing on the roof so suddenly that the reindeer were astonished at his agility. I wish they could all hang up their stockings, he thought, as he drove to the next chimney. It would save me a lot of time, and I would then visit more children before daybreak. Then Margot and Dick and Ned and Sarah jumped out of bed next morning and ran downstairs to get their stockings from the fireplace. They were filled with delight to find the toys from Santa Claus inside them. In fact, I think they found more presents in their stockings than any other children of that city had received, for Santa Claus was in a hurry and did not stop to count the toys. Of course, they told all their little friends about it, And of course, every one of them decided to hang his own stockings by the fireplace the next Christmas Eve. Even Bessie Blithesome, who made a visit to that city with her father, the great Lord of Lurd, heard the story from the children and hung her own pretty stockings by the chimney when she returned home at Christmas time. On his next trip, Santa Claus found so many stockings hung up in anticipation of his visit that he could fill them in a jiffy and be away again in half the time required to hunt the children up and place the toys by their bedsides. The custom grew year after year and has always been a great help to Santa Claus. And with so many children to visit, he surely needs all the help we are able to give him. Chapter 12. First Christmas Tree. Claus has always kept his promise to the Knooks by returning to the Laughing Valley by daybreak, but only the swiftness of his reindeer has enabled him to do this, for he travels all over the world. He loved his work, and he loved the brisk night ride on his sledge and the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells. On that first trip, with the 10 reindeer, only Glossie and Flossie wore bells. But each year thereafter, for 8 years, Claus carried presents to the children of the Gnome King, and that good-natured monarch gave him in return a string of bells at each visit, so that finally every one of the 10 deer was supplied, and you may imagine what a merry tune the bells played as the sledge sped over the snow. The children's stockings were so long it required a great many toys to fill them, and soon Claus found that there were other things besides toys that children love. So he sent some of the fairies, who were always his good friends, into the tropics, from whence they returned with great bags full of oranges and bananas, which they had plucked from the trees. And other fairies flew to the wonderful valley of Funnyland, where delicious candies and bonbons grow thickly on the bushes, and returned laden with many boxes of sweetmeats for the little ones. These things Santa Claus, on each Christmas Eve, placed in the long stockings together with his toys, and were glad to get them, you may be sure. There are also warm countries where there is no snow in winter, but Claus and his reindeer visited them as well as the colder climes, for there were little wheels inside the runners of his sledge, which permitted it to run as smoothly over bare ground as on the snow. And the children who lived in the warm countries learned to know the name of Santa Claus as well as those who lived nearer to the Laughing Valley. Once, just as the reindeer were ready to start on their yearly trip, a fairy came to Claus and told him of 3 little children who lived beneath a rude tent of skins on a broad plain where there were no trees whatever. These poor babies were miserable and unhappy, for their parents were ignorant people who neglected them sadly. Claus resolved to visit these children before he returned home, and during his ride he picked up the bushy top of a pine tree, which the wind had broken off, and placed it in his sledge. It was nearly morning when the deer stopped before the lonely tent of skins, where the poor children lay asleep. Claus at once planted the bit of pine tree in the sand and stuck many candles on the branches. Then he hung some of his prettiest toys on the tree, as well as several bags of candies. It did not take long to do all of this, for Santa Claus works quickly, and when all was ready, he lighted the candles, and thrusting his head in at the opening of the tent, he shouted, "Merry Christmas, little ones!" With that, he leaped into his sledge and was out of sight before the children, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, could come out and to see who had called them. You can imagine the wonder and joy of those little ones who had never in their lives known a real pleasure before, when they saw the tree sparkling with lights that shone brilliant in the gray dawn and hung with toys enough to make them happy for years to come. They joined hands and danced around the tree, shouting and laughing until they were obliged to pause for breath. And their people came out to look and wonder, and therefore had more respect and consideration for their children, since Santa Claus had honored them with such beautiful gifts. The idea of Christmas tree pleased Claus, and so the following year he carried many of them in his sledge and set them up in the homes of poor people who seldom saw trees, and placed candles and toys on their branches. Of course, he could not carry enough trees in one load of all who wanted them, but in some homes the fathers were able to get trees and have them all ready for Santa Claus when he arrived. The good Claus always decorated as prettily as possible and hung with toys enough for all the children who came to see the tree lighted. These novel ideas and the generous manner in which they were carried out made the children long for that one night in the year when their friend Santa Claus should visit them. And as such anticipation is very pleasant and comforting, the little ones gleaned much happiness by wondering what it would happen when Santa Claus next arrived. Perhaps you remember that stern Baron Braun, who once drove Claus from his castle and forbade him to visit his children? Well, many years afterward, when the old Baron was dead and his son ruled in his place, the new Baron Braun came to the house of Claus with his train of knights and pages and henchmen, and dismounting from his charger, bared his head humbly before the friend of the children. "My father did not know your goodness and worth," he said, "and therefore threatened to have the castle walls. But I have children of my own who long for a visit from Santa Claus, and I have come to beg that you will favor them hereafter as you do other children." Claus was pleased with his speech, for Castle Braun was the only place he had never visited, and he gladly promised to bring presents to the Baron's children the next Christmas Eve. The Baron went away contented, and Claus kept his promise faithfully. Thus did this man, through very goodness, conquer the hearts of all, and it is no wonder he was very merry. There was no wonder he was ever merry and gay, for there was no home in the wide world where he was not welcomed more royally than any king. And we will stop here today and return with Old Age, Chapter 1, The Mantle of Immortality. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you've enjoyed Storytimes Classics Live. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday today, and join us again tomorrow for the continuation of the life and adventures of Santa Claus. Have a great day. Stay safe out there, and remember, please wear a mask.